say that he does have ties to Muslim extremists. I don't know.
This is the biggest investment in our armed forces since the Cold War.
In mid-March, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson dropped the bombshell by announcing a 40% increase in the country's nuclear arsenal. Under the Integrated Review of Security, Defence, Development and Foreign Policy, the UK plans to raise the cap on the number of Trident nuclear warheads from 180 to 260 by the middle of the decade. Identifying Russia as the most acute threat to UK security, the Kingdom, according to the Integrated Review, will no longer publish figures on the size of its operational stockpile to maintain deliberate ambiguity for adversaries. This is the UK's first such increase since the end of the Cold War, making London look aggressive and hostile. The shocking point in the Integrated Review was that the UK would increase its arsenal of nuclear warheads not only to deter traditional threats, but also to confront biological, chemical and perhaps even cyber assaults. The British government says the increase in warheads is in recognition of the evolving security environment, including the developing range of technological and doctrinal threat. Experts reviewing the language say it suggests in the event of a crippling biological, chemical, cyber or dirty bomb attacks on mass proportions, then Britain would consider a nuclear counterattack. Each warhead the UK holds is estimated to have an explosive power of 100 kilotons. By way of comparison, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima at the end of the Second World War was about 15 kilotons. Trident warheads are loaded onto ballistic missile submarines as part of what London calls the country's nuclear deterrence strategy. At least one nuclear-armed sub is always on patrol. Asked why the British government wanted to end 3 decades of gradual disarmament, Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab answered, "Why? Because it is the ultimate guarantee, the ultimate insurance policy against the worst threat from hostile states." Minutes after Johnson unveiled the plan to lift the cap, Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif condemned on Twitter what he called Johnson's utter hypocrisy, adding, "Unlike the UK and its allies, Iran believes nukes and all WMDs are barbaric and must be eradicated." Britain has faced a serious national emergency over the past year, whereas NHS nurses, the heroes of the fight, received a 1% pay increase in acknowledgement. London has found billions of pounds to spend on its armed force amid the pandemic, an issue that has caused a huge outcry in different political parties. A Green Party Member of Parliament, Caroline Lucas, called the increase a provocative, illegal and morally obscene use of resources. The Scottish National Party tweeted, "A shameful sum of money that could be used to tackle child poverty instead." Some other campaigners warned the UK was at risk of starting a new nuclear arms race at a time when the world is trying to emerge from the COVID pandemic. According to Kate Hudson, the General Secretary of UK-based Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, this is no time to start a new nuclear arms race. As the world wrestles with the pandemic and climate chaos, it beggars belief that our government is opting to increase Britain's nuclear arsenal.
Earlier today, the Foreign Secretary justified breaking our nuclear non-proliferation treaty obligations on the grounds that nuclear weapons are, and I quote, "the ultimate insurance policy against the worst threat from hostile states." Well, the logical consequence of that position is surely that every country should be allowed to acquire nuclear weapons on the same insurance policy grounds.
British governments always assert their commitment to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT. And the Integrated Review is no exception. It states, "We are strongly committed to full implementation of the NPT in all its aspects, including nuclear disarmament." That's while increasing Britain's nuclear arsenal violates the country's legal obligations under the NPT, which Britain ratified in 1970. The treaty requires countries that have nuclear weapons to disarm, and those that don't have them not to get them. So there is no way in which increasing a nuclear arsenal is legitimate under the treaty.
There's no real positive vision for anything other than a competitive future for a nuclear-armed Britain. How is the UK going to use this, this increased capital? Because one of the things this does do, of course, is increases the UK's negotiating capital if it were ever to be wrapped into any kind of multilateral conversation. So there is some upside here, but there isn't any real positive vision of how the UK would look to achieve that. And I think to the allies, the non-nuclear weapon allies that simultaneously value the UK's defence and their deterrence on their behalf, including nuclear deterrence, but have difficult domestic debates to manage around the legitimacy of nuclear weapons, that sort of absence of consideration will cause them a problem.
In the words of Stuart MacDonald, the defence spokesman for the Scottish National Party, for the Prime Minister to stand up and champion the international rules-based system before announcing in the same breath that the UK plans to violate its commitments to the International Treaty on Non-Proliferation beggars belief. Reversing the UK's course of consistent post-Cold War nuclear reductions, the Integrated Review is undermining the diplomatic image of the UK as the government paints a picture of a world with growing international competition and increasing threats from countries such as Russia, China and North Korea. In terms of international disarmament diplomacy, the decision is unequivocally damaging to the UK's reputation. It will incur strong criticism at the upcoming Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference.
This statement is one more insight into just how hollow the brand of global Britain actually is. Because the Prime Minister's rhetoric always fails to come close to reality. Today, the Prime Minister preaches about international obligation, when only yesterday our closest partners in the EU are bringing his government to court for breaking international law. The Prime Minister talks about partnership with nations across the world in the very week that the most senior figures in the US, including the Speaker of Congress, warned against the UK's increasingly unilateralist approach. The chasm between the Prime Minister's rhetoric and the reality of his government's actions is deeply damaging. Just because he wastes £2.6 million desperately trying to copy the White House's press briefing room doesn't hide the reality of the UK's weakening global influence.
The Integrated Review comes at a moment of considerable change and disruption in the UK's nuclear warhead programme. The last year saw the announcement of a decision to build a new warhead, revelations about the UK's nuclear dependence on the US, and the renationalisation of the atomic weapons establishment. These developments, against the background of the coronavirus pandemic and Brexit negotiations, have passed with little parliamentary comment. In fact, the most significant change in the UK's nuclear posture in decades has still not been properly debated in Parliament.
Mr. Speaker, I voted for the renewal of Trident, and the Labour Party's support for nuclear deterrence is non-negotiable. But this review breaks the goal. This review breaks the goal of successive Prime Ministers and cross-party efforts to reduce our nuclear stockpile. It doesn't explain when, why, or for what strategic purpose. So the Prime Minister needs to answer that question today.
Johnson's decision to increase Britain's nuclear arsenal poses a disturbing question. It's not just that the people would rather the money was spent on something more useful, or that this blatant breach of the NPT may encourage others to pursue nuclear weapons. It's a question of what kind of role Britain wants to play in the post-Brexit, post-coronavirus era, being prepared to spend billions of pounds on nuclear warheads. The British Conservative Party's long-standing love affair with nuclear power might trigger an uncontrolled arms race in a world more unstable and unpredictable than even during the Cold War.